We just learned how Bootstrap's grid system works by creating a little grid system of our own. Now it's time to drop our grid system and learn how to use bootstraps. And the first thing we need to know is that anytime we use bootstrap classes in our HTML, they need to be nested within a container. And there are two types of containers we can choose from. The first is called container, and the second is called container fluid. And these are denoted by classes we assign to div elements. Notice also that we've included this class called highlight in our div elements, but that's not a bootstrap class, that's a class I created in order to highlight the div elements themselves. But back to the discussion about container and container fluid, container will take up most of the width of our viewport, while container fluid will take up all of the width of our viewport. Let's go to the browser to see the difference between these two classes. Exactly like we just talked about, the container class takes up most of the viewport, while the container fluid class takes up all the viewport. There's no right or wrong class to use, it all depends on what you're trying to accomplish. So whether you select to use the container class or the container fluid class is at your discretion. Next, I'm going to nest a row within a container to begin building our grid. In this case, I'm going to nest the row within a container fluid class because I want the row to span the entire width of our viewport. Remember, div elements are block level elements, so they'll take up the full width of their parent element. In this case, because the parent element spans the full width of our viewport and the row takes up 100% of its parent block, the row is also going to take up 100% of our viewport. Let's go to the browser to see how this looks. Just as we expected, the row takes up 100% of the width of our viewport. We've begun building our grid system, but currently we only have rows. Let's see if we can slice these rows up by adding columns. Bootstrap actually allows us to target different width viewports with different column classes. And the first type of column class that we're going to look at is the column large class. In this case, we're going to nest a column large-6 class within our row. And this simply means if our viewport is a large width viewport, then we want this divider to take up 6 columns. And when we view our web page in the browser, we see it does exactly that. And not only that, but it responds to the size of our viewport by taking up the full row in the case that our viewport is smaller than what it would consider to be large. And so this behavior is very similar to what we observed when we created our own columns in the last section. The call-large set of classes target large viewports. These are things like large desktop monitors, but we can target smaller viewports as well using Bootstrap. For instance, we can target things like laptops using call-medium classes. So now let's see how this looks in the browser. And just as we'd expect, the call-medium-6 class takes up 6 columns as long as our viewport is sufficiently wide. But watch what happens as we shrink our viewport. First, the call-large-6 class takes up the full row because now our viewport is no longer considered to be a large viewport. Then, the call-medium class takes up the entire row because it's now no longer considered to be a medium viewport. There are two other sets of column classes that target even smaller viewports. The first is the call-sm class that targets viewports on things like tablets, and the second is the call-xs class, which targets viewports on things like mobile devices. Now, columns in the SM class will still expand out to take up the entire row if the viewport is smaller than what would be considered to be a small viewport. However, the call-xs set of classes will always be however many columns we set them in their class. And one last time, let's see how this looks in our browser. As we'd expect, given a sufficiently large viewport, all 4 types of classes take up 6 columns. But as we shrink the viewport, first the large columns go, then the medium columns go, then the small columns go. However, the extra small columns always stay exactly 6 columns wide of our viewport.